I remember a few years back when I was CEO of the MTA, probably 8 years ago, we were looking for a way to continue to provide amazing service when it comes to paratransit operations, but do it in a more cost-efficient manner. And I heard about a CEO in Florida who was just started doing something like that, and that was Brad Miller. Brad is and was CEO of the Panelists Suncoast Transit Authority, and he started using, this is in the Clearwater, Florida area, he started using these TNCs, transport networking companies, to help him do things like, provide late night service, maybe rescue rides, first and last mile solution, and again, potentially supplementing paratransit service with customers who would opt into it. So the idea continued to develop. You probably are aware of this, and now cities across the country are using various paratransit supplemental service through companies like Uber and Lyft, and even ADA service with companies like Userve and Silverride and others. So today we're going to continue to talk about this new advent of service provision where transit agencies can utilize services such as Uber and Lyft and others to supplement their service. But also there's a threat on the horizon that we'll tell you about at the end of the show, which you may want to hear about. So Brad Miller kicks off the show today. He is the CEO, as mentioned, of the Panelists Suncoast Transit Authority. He's the regional transit authority serving the Tampa Bay region on the west coast of Florida with more than 300 buses and 920 dedicated employees. We also have Dr. Judy Shanley, who is the National Director of Transportation, Mobility, and Youth at the National Office of Easterseals. The National Easterseals Society has been one of the real leaders in paratransit operations. She directs several U.S. Department of Transportation projects funded by the FTA and other groups. We also have on here Alex Elegudin. He is CEO of Wheeling Forward and the former accessibility chief of the largest paratransit operation in America in New York City, the New York City MTA. He has spent almost a decade working as an advocate and mentor of the disability community. He wrote an article in Newsweek magazine that we talk about today that really brought this issue to the forefront, this challenge to utilizing companies like Uber and Lyft. He'll talk about that today. And then we brought on Jen Shepard, who leads Uber's global transit business. She's a partner to cities and transit agencies with a mission of making transit more accessible to those who need it most. This is a fascinating look into how TNCs like Uber are used by public transit agencies and this potential threat that's looming on the horizon that came in through regulations coming out of Washington, of course. And she'll talk about that, as will the other guests on the show on this episode of Transit Unplugged. Well, great to have a great panel with us today talking about what I consider one of the latest and greatest trends in public transportation, and that is the use of TNCs, micromobility, to assist public transit agencies to provide paratransit service. And as mentioned in the opening, we've got a great panel with us. One of them is a good friend of mine, Brad Miller. Brad and I have been buddies for well over a decade. And Brad, I remember back when I was CEO of MTA in Baltimore, I heard this guy down in Florida was doing something cool with Uber because we were all concerned about costs, right? The cost of providing paratransit service. Like, I can give you an example. At Baltimore, I had an $800 million operating budget, and I spent $100 million of that on paratransit. This was 8 years ago. And the cost was going up at 6 to 8% a year, whereas my regular costs were going up 2%. So I was like, this is unsustainable. There has to be a solution. And it turned out there was. And you're the one that kind of found it for us. Tell us about what you did and what you're doing now.
Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me and the other great people that are on this podcast on this podcast. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that was back in 2016. PSDA started off small, but we were the first agency in the country to have a contract with Uber. And that was a great moment. I don't think you and other people that heard about it probably had any idea what was really going on with it. But just fast forward from then to now, and it has been a complete game changer, in my opinion, for mobility in my community down here in St. Petersburg, Florida. Of course, we started off with a first mile, last mile kind of program where people could get a discounted Uber ride to and from a bus stop. Right. We extended that to late night services. After the buses stop running, people maybe get to a job on the bus, but then they need to get home. A low income person, we have a program for that where they can catch a discounted Uber or Lyft ride. And then finally, we received one of the first Federal Transit Administration sandbox grants back in 2017. We were part of the first group to test whether TNCs could be effective for paratransit use. And so we launched that. And oh my gosh, that has just been such a huge I think, a very, very positive thing for people with disabilities in our county. The mobility of being able to get a ride like you and I can, Paul, on a moment's notice. We of course operate our traditional paratransit. We provide our regular paratransit options, and then we provide what we call down here mobility on demand. Essentially, that you can get a real-time ride when you need it. And so people might schedule a paratransit ride to the doctor, but no one knows when their doctor's going to actually see them because you might wait forever. So I'll just call you when I'm done, and then they get a ride home. Or hey, I don't need paratransit just for medical appointments. I can go to the movies. I can go to Applebee's and go to lunch with my daughter, or I can just be a normal person. I've had many people in the transit industry say, Brad, what you guys are doing down there is, people in the disability community are saying, you're actually treating us like everybody else, giving us the mobility that everybody else already has. And it's really been gratifying to me in my career to just see the benefit that this has provided. Now, we're on this podcast today because there is a threat to that great mobility that we are partnering with our TNCs with. The federal government issued a proposed change to the rules governing the use of TNCs by transit agencies at the very end of the Biden administration. And on December 30th is when it was published in the Federal Register. And so now we're coming into this kind of question period with the new administration coming in. Are they going to enact these rules? There is a public comment period going on. Essentially, what would happen is the federal government would prohibit PSTA, my agency, or any transit agency in the country from essentially contracting with a TNC. And that would force me and hundreds of other cities to cancel these great mobility programs. And so that's why we're trying to get the word out about this and get a good reaction from people.
That's something, Brad. Well, let's jump over to you, Judy. I've always admired the National Easterseals Society. You all have been really leaders in this industry. I remember back when I started in the late 1980s in this industry, running a small bus system here in the county. We were always getting our training programs from the National Easterseals Society about how to train our drivers, et cetera, to help people with disabilities. And now you're the National Director of Transportation and Mobility and Youth there at the National Office of Easterseals. Tell us about, what your all's role is in this whole issue and where you're at on it.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me. I feel very privileged to be part of this panel. Easterseals has been a leader in this space for over 100 years. We were actually at the table when the provisions in the Americans with Disabilities Act came to be around transportation opportunities and paratransit services for individuals with disabilities. And I think the innovations that we've seen in the transportation sector, and particularly with paratransit, have been phenomenal. The use of transportation network companies and other modes to complement existing services has been amazing. And essentially, transportation and paratransit options and the innovation with TNCs has created opportunities for people. The Americans with Disabilities Act suggests that, or mandates that the paratransit service be comparable to a fixed route service, but often it's not comparable to fixed route service. And it doesn't give riders, it doesn't give people with disabilities who we want to be included in society. We want people to access jobs and education and healthcare. It doesn't give them the same opportunity, as Brad said, as you and me. And so I think thinking innovatively and creatively about the ways that people with disabilities can access services and community settings is really critical. And paratransit has been important to that effort. And now the whole innovation in terms of paratransit has been important. And, what's going on in terms of the changing legislation could potentially compromise the ability of people to be integrated and included in their communities. So, yeah, Easterseals is excited to be part of this conversation. So thanks.
Thank you, Judy. That's great. And Alex, you actually just wrote an article in Newsweek magazine, dude, big time, that I happened to read yesterday, which really framed this issue well. Tell us a little bit about your background, what got you, interested in this issue. Obviously, you've got a personal connection to it because you use the services and you're an attorney, and so you've been involved in a lot of this. Talk to us about you, the group you formed, and what your thoughts are on this whole topic.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I've got a little bit of a career background in this. I was originally the accessibility program manager leading accessibility initiatives at the New York City Taxi Limousine Commission back around 2015. And at that time, we were working with Uber to create the wheelchair accessible service model for their services generally, not just paratransit in New York City, and worked a lot on kind of taxi and integration issues for accessibility. Later on, I served as the head of accessibility chief at MTA New York City Transit. And, one thing that, I always see myself a little bit as a disability crusader in terms of policies and causes related to paratransit, but even taking TNCs aside for half a second, one thing that we did at my time at the MTA was this service. When you think about paratransit back in the 90s, it's the little mini buses driving around counties and cities and providing that service. And that service was traditionally, that's how it started. And, probably fits better under an FTA type of model. There are many buses, many versions of true city buses. And traditionally, even at New York City MTA, the largest paratransit provider in the country, 50 to 70 to 80% of trips back in the teens were being fulfilled by those mini buses. During my time, something that I started was like, look, we have such a capacity and increase over whether it's yellow taxis, TNCs, other kinds of vehicles. Why are we not using them? They're more nimble. They don't have to go on a manifest route that, if somebody's 5 minutes late, the next person's 2 hours late, all this kind of stuff. And by the time I actually left the MTA, the paratransit service as it existed, was doing about 70% of trips via taxi or other types of services that weren't minibuses. So this is the beginning of the innovation, and then it kind of follows through to the next steps, and you start thinking about TNCs and Uber. Uber is doing in their general service, standard service, billions of trips, not millions, billions of trips a year. Completely have modernized this. Everybody knows this. And slowly there has been a nice ongoing integration into transit services, both public transit and microtransit, paratransit. Agencies are getting comfortable with Uber, it takes the government and transit regulators a little bit more time. There's a little bit of this is how we've always done it that always gets stuck in an agency. But we've seen tremendous growth. It's not just the dynamic routing and the capacity where there are Uber drivers everywhere, right? So you don't have to send a driver from one part of New York City to another, but the flexibility, the routing, the fact that you don't have to do it 24 hours in advance, all things that are completely life-changing, all things that our peers and the non-disabled, those without disabilities have access to. And this is what's been kind of going on. And, you come to a point in a regulatory situation here where the FTA rules, as they've always been imagined, were always more about true buses, true trains, and, things like that. And it needs to change. It's antiquated. We're no longer living in that. Everybody knows that the best way, yes, if there's a fixed route service and it's great and it's accessible, that there are capacity reasons. There's, especially in New York City. There are 500 subway stations in New York City. So we get it. But even in New York City, sometimes you need a different type of model to kind of get you the rest of the way or help you, especially when you have an inaccessible transit system. And, we've come to an impasse where the regulator is ultimately doubling down a little bit on times of the past and something that doesn't work, where we really need innovative thinking to allow companies like Uber to transform paratransit. It's an equity issue to really bring, the ADA says the word comparable. The things that have been going on in paratransit for 30 years have not delivered comparable. And this is what's next. And it's good for business. It's good for people because people will be working, there'll be economy, there'll be taxes, there'll be more trips. It's good for the community. It's good for transit agencies. It's a win-win. We just need our regulators to kind of get on board.
So what exactly is the regulation? What is being proposed?
So since 2001, paratransit services, or all, as Alex mentioned, all transit drivers since the 1990s have required to be part of a random drug testing pool, to be bus drivers, train drivers, ferry drivers, whatever, have been, everybody knows this. I know, Paul, you certainly know this from your time. Drug testing is part of our business, out of our traditional business. All my bus drivers at my agency are drug tested. In 2001, the FTA issued a rule that said, well, a lot of transit systems are using taxis back then to complement their paratransit, to add at times and things like that. It became unworkable to have taxi companies be drug tested. So they issued what they call the taxi exemption. If the rider, not the transit system, if the rider chose the taxi cab company back then that they would ride in, FTA said that those taxi companies were exempt from the drug and alcohol policy rules. So if there was a rider choice, the transit agencies would give a choice to the customers of a couple different cab companies to get a ride from. Those cab companies did not need to be exempt. Then Uber and Lyft weren't even created back in 2001. They didn't exist, right? When all these rules that are now being followed, as Alex was saying, they're just very outdated because Uber didn't even exist. 10 years ago, Uber was created, and FTA shortly came out with a statement that said, okay, the taxi exemption from 2001 applied to Uber and Lyft. They would just treat it the same. As long as there's a choice, it's the rider's choice, not Brad's choice, not the agency's choice, but the rider's choice, they can be exempt. Well, December 30th, 2024, that whole system was eliminated. It's proposed to be eliminated by the FTA.
So what are they saying? They're saying now that taxi drivers and Uber have to be drug tested to be able to be used by a transit agency?
Yes. Yeah. Therefore, the way they've done that is they've said transit agencies are prohibited from contracting with Uber, Lyft, taxi, any service provider that does not have drug-tested drivers. And that obviously would be a huge change to what has happened. And as a transit agency, I know this is a transit podcast, so I wanted to just say to my peers and colleagues, I try to follow the rules. I try to be a good manager and follow the FTA. I love FTA. I love them $28 million for buses and things like that, So I get it that they have the law passed by Congress to drug test transit drivers. I understand where they're kind of in a pickle here, but we have tried to build our programs all up. And I know transit systems across the country have done the same thing, following these rules. And then just to kind of change the game immediately is a real problem.
Can I add something to what Brad said? I mean, I just want to clarify. I know somebody may be listening and they hear, oh, get rid of drug and alcohol testing. Like what? Why would we do that? That sounds bad. So I'm just going to get a little in the weeds here because explaining this issue is a little tough, but the FTA and federal rules have a random drug and alcohol testing standard. This means that if you're part of a program like this, you can get, your pager, you can get a text message on your phone. You got to go get drug tested right now. There's all kinds of other, very significant aspects and burdens to being part of that program. That's what airline pilots do, Amtrak engineers, full-time bus drivers. These are full-time transit operators, carrying transit of, 10, 20, 30, hundreds of people. And there's all kinds of documentation and all kinds of requirements. Look, when you talk about Uber and TNCs, it's a completely different world. It's the gig transportation economy. These drivers doing a couple, I'm sure they're averaging less than 5 trips a week. I don't even know what the numbers are, but it's some small number, and it's probably not that they don't want to do it. It's just to sign up for that, there's a cost, there's an expense. They have other jobs. What are they going to tell their other boss that if you got to leave? It just doesn't make any sense.
So this isn't just pre-employment that FTA is requiring. This is like the full enchilada or whatever they say, how you got to do all the random and dude, that's interesting. What do you think of that, Judy? What's your thoughts on all this from the National Easterseals?
I think it impacts upon the availability of rides for me, for the individuals with disabilities that we serve, and it's missing opportunities for people. We often hear of the paratransit argument about it's so costly, and a lot of entities talk about these innovations as a cost-effective benefit, but I think it's more than cost. The community would be missing out on a viable pool of people as employees. Healthcare agencies wouldn't be able to provide healthcare services because people couldn't get there, and therefore people would be in the community and not be able to work and participate in society like we all do. So I think the community costs of this, the community benefit of not having people because they can't get to where they need to go is a really critical piece. And it's a missed, I have no choice. If I have less choice in the transportation modes that I choose, that's going to limit me in being part of a community. And that's what I'm concerned about, and feel that is one of the biggest impacts about this regulatory change.
So we do have with us Jen Shepard. Jen is head of Uber's global transit business. So you're the right person to be talking to here, Jen. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, all right, you've heard the issue here. What's going to be Uber's response? Let's say the new administration, the Trump administration says, yes, we're going to agree with what the Biden administration said, on the last day of the year, last year. We're going to require all these Uber and taxi drivers to get drug tested. What are you guys going to do?
Yes. Well, first off, I hope that's not the case. I very much agree with the panelists we have here. So just laying some foundations here. Uber, as Alex mentioned, is a very large platform. We do billions of trips. In 2023, it was like 9 billion trips globally. We're highly regulated, built with safety in mind to provide access to reliable mobility service in our markets. Second, we're not a dedicated transit operator, as I think everyone has been talking about. We are different than the folks that drive the dedicated buses and so forth. We fill in for the mobility managers like Brad and Brad's team where they need it most. So it could be transit deserts, it could be paratransit same day. We're not dedicated here. And frankly, inside Uber, our transit business is quite small to us. We do this because we think it's the right thing to do, and we think it's the right thing to do for our communities. Third, I'll say the product we use for transit is the same product you and me would use as consumers. So you, Paul, if you order a ride, you get the exact same product as what we use for these transit programs in many cases. The driver never even knows that they're riding as part of a transit program. They don't know.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Yes, they don't know who's paying for the trip. And we provide the same level of service to these opt-in programs where the riders really want that level of service. So they're
getting the exact same service as anyone else.
That's correct. That's correct.
So it is commensurate, kind of the spirit of the law, right? Or the word of the law. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't force these programs on anyone. And like Brad's program, it's all voluntary opt-in. And so we believe we're offering the service for the folks who really want it. We've looked at our transit data, our program data, and what we found is that it's true what Alex mentioned. Drivers on our program only incidentally complete these transit trips. And so what do I mean by that incidental? I mean that in one large city that we've looked at in the last 60 days, over 90% of drivers who drove for that transit program drove 1 or 2 trips in the last 60 days. Out of probably hundreds of trips that they did in those 60 days, they literally drove only 1 or 2 trips as part of the transit program. They don't know who's paying for it. It's the same product that the consumer would get. And so it doesn't make practical sense to really ask these drivers to do testing over and above what is already required for them to do to be able to operate, their business as part of our markets today. And lastly, to answer your question, so if this policy is formalized as proposed, unfortunately, we will likely ramp down many of our transit programs in collaboration with the agencies. Of course, it'll be very sad for us. Local communities will likely lose access to the benefits that we get. That's
something. Well, look, can I ask you a tough follow-up question?
Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, let me put on the other hat, right? So, isn't this about safety? Why is drug and alcohol testing not a good thing, Jen?
Yeah. So I want to say, safety is very, very important to Uber. So stand for safety is actually one of our core Uber company values. And we do a lot to ensure safety on the platform. So technology, policy enforcement, customer support, they all help to create safer environments for our users. Our drivers must undergo driving and criminal background screening, have proper documentation, agree to our community guidelines, which do include a zero tolerance policy for discrimination in drug and alcohol use. We have lots of great tools that we use from a technology perspective, real-time GPS tracking, sharing ride status with others, emergency assistance button, real-time driver identity check, safety support team 24/7, and then the rating system as well. We publish an online safety report available to anyone, and we continue to show critical safety incidents are very rare on our platform. In fact, our most recent report had 99.9998% of trips concluded without any critical safety incident, 99.9% without any safety incidents at all.
That might be better than most transit agencies, to be honest with you. That's a pretty good number there.
Well, we disclose it publicly. And then from an operational perspective, I mentioned before, but our transit programs are always opt-in. So if a customer is not comfortable with the level of service we provide, the agency provides alternatives for them. So creating these compliance burdens, which we would clarify as the FTA's proposed policy update, does likely point to Uber ending our transit partnership. So in my mind, that's not a good thing. Lastly, I will say I was very curious last night, poking around the Federal Register, and I noticed in 2018, there was a federal rule that allowed TNCs to be used for federal work travel. So for employees of the federal government to use TNCs and get reimbursed for it. And so my question then is, if TNCs are good enough for federal employees to use for their work travel, why are they not good enough for the folks in our community who need it most as part of these transit programs?
Thanks, Jen. That's very interesting. And that last piece you brought up is also interesting. So let me just go back to you, Brad, on the transit side, because this is a transit podcast generally. What's it? So Jen said, if this rule goes through, we're ramping down. What's that going to mean to you and your customers?
It's going to have a major impact to thousands of people in my county. I'm personally, I'm a transit CEO. So what I'm most worried about is like all those fine people are going to show up in my boardroom at my podium and yell at me.
Yeah.
No, I mean, Jen has been a great leader of this and helping us out with all these programs. And she said it exactly right. It's going to be a major reduction in mobility for thousands of people in my county that are very, very loving it. You know, we always give all of our customers an option. We have our traditional paratransit and our services available to them. And over the last 2 years, you could just see the transition. Folks that are given an option of a real-time ride that comes in like 5 minutes rather than a pre-scheduled day before thing. It's just a totally different product. And when they see it, they choose it. Now, 2/3 of all of our paratransit rides are on TNCs, Uber and Lyft.
Wow.
And 1/3 are pre-scheduled rides on traditional paratransit. It's a complete game changer. It'll really be a major impact. Now, I get it. Safety is part of my job description and all of our all transit systems requirements. We have to ensure safety of all of our customers. We have tons of FTA rules and regulations related to making sure we provide safe rides for all. So we are carefully tracking ever since we started contracting with Uber and Lyft about how their safety record compares to our traditional forms. And just as Jen said, at least in our county, the accident rates of our mobility on demand, our TNC programs versus traditional paratransit, drug-tested drivers is the same or better. The safety record of our mobility services is, I feel comfortable, is just as safe or better, even though they are not drug tested.
All right, Alex, you're the lawyer. What's next?
Well, let me actually, I want to throw in one comment before I do.
All right.
I want to add some credence here to what Jen said. You know, Uber's not paying me to say this. For many of you that know me, when I was the regulator, when I worked as a regulator at the TLC, I forced some pretty harsh, and I don't want to say harsh, you should have been doing it anyway, but some pretty strict rules on Uber and even at the TLC, at the TLC and the MTA. Look, the truth is, I just want to address the elephant in the room that, Uber could do this. They just don't want to be regulated or whatever. It's not. If Uber stood up and created a random drug and alcohol testing program, which I'm sure they could do, they're a big company, they're going to create the bridge or an empty warehouse. The drivers aren't going to do it. Uber can't force them to do it. It's not that Uber doesn't want to. It's why would a driver sign up and do this? If they don't get a paratransit trip or a microtransit trip, they're going to get another trip. Uber's got enough trips to go around. But it's a matter of how do you get these drivers to do it? So just want to kind of clear that out there. It's just a matter of how the world has changed and transportation's changed. No one's trying to be a bad person here. Everybody just needs to innovate and get with what's new. And what's new is what's next. So this rule is currently in the Federal Registrar. The docket number is FTA-2024-0020. We want to encourage everyone. Right now, it's in a comment period. We are hopeful that, maybe the current government does something about it before it gets to the end of its comment period, which I believe is around February 13th. But we want people with disabilities, those who enjoy TNC as a service, to get on there, submit a comment. This is not the direction we should be going. How TNCs in transit have revolutionized your life. We need people to come out against this. It's also an opportunity to talk to your local transit operators and elected officials. This is a moment in the disability community. When you think about the integral part transportation plays, people need to say, we want what everyone else has. We want the same benefits and types of service that people with disabilities have. And this is a way to get there. Your elected officials at every level need to know about it. Your transit operators. It's a little bit of a complicated issue. I say that, but it behooves us as the disability community, myself as a quadriplegic, to get to know the issues and to get our voice out there.
Judy, coming from the National Easterseals Society, to me, one of the most respected organizations in the country on this whole issue, let's let you have the last word. Any final thoughts?
It's about spontaneity. It's been said, but to summarize, it's all about me having a choice where I want to go, when I want to go. And without the varying options that these innovations create, those inhibit my spontaneity. So be at the table, talk with the local people. As Alex said, your planning organization, the MPOs, your local legislators about what this potentially could mean, and have a larger discussion about the transportation options in your community. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy, Jen, Alex, and Brad, for bringing this issue. We at Transit Unplugged like to be on top of the cutting edge issues that are impacting public transit. And there couldn't be more cutting edge than this, since the thing is going to kick in a couple weeks. So we appreciate newsjacking this article for your article, Alex, from Newsweek, and this information out to the industry, the public transit industry around the U.S. And I think it's important for people around the world to hear it too, and to hear what's going on here in the U.S. with this issue. Thank you again for everybody for being our guests, kind of on a last minute notice. We appreciate it. And best wishes to you all in this issue.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Transit Unplugged with our special guests, Dr. Judy L. Shanley, Alex Elegudin, Jen Shepard, and Brad Miller. We thank them for coming on the show at the last minute to talk about this really important issue facing transit agencies across the United States. Now, coming up next week, we have our special episode featuring women in Australia leading the way in public transport. We have Lauren Streifer, Jamie Lee Owen, Katie Cooper, and Michelle Batsas joining Paul and special co-host Kelly Chapman for a discussion about everything going on in Australia with transit and the initiatives that Michelle especially has done to encourage more women to become part of the public transit industry. Transit Unplugged is brought to you by Modaxo. At Modaxo, we're passionate about moving the world's people, and at Transit Unplugged, we're passionate about telling those stories. So until next week, ride safe and ride happy.